Hello, welcome to another Mundane Monday. I'm Sally Ducharme, and it is Monday, February 27th, 2023. And so the chart I've been looking at a lot this past week is a chart of former President Jimmy Carter. It was announced about a week ago that he has declined further medical treatment and has entered hospice care at home. And so I thought, well, let's just take a look at his chart and see what would explain his amazing longevity. He's 98 years old, is now the longest living president, longest retired president, probably the longest married president, too. I think he and Rosalind have celebrated 75 years of marriage. And so he's broken a lot of records. And so I was wondering, what is the secret of his amazing life force? Because he has stayed vital and active in public life well into his 90s. And so let's see. First, we notice that he's got that Libra sun, which by itself is in its fall. Libra sun likes to partner in order to gain more light and strength. And Jimmy Carter has often said that the secret of his longevity is a good marriage. He and Rosalind have known each other since they were children. And so she has been very much at his side in every one of his endeavors. So we've got that Libra sun then also made more strong by being in the first house. Planets always have more strength when angular, especially in the first or 10th houses. And it's also, notice, the first planet rising in his chart, which gives it additional kind of oomph. And so there's another secret, though, to this Libra sun. Notice it's ruled by Venus. And what sign is Venus in? But Libra. I'm sorry, Leo. And so they are in what's called mutual reception. Venus is in the sun sign and the sun is in Libra sign. And so that helps them work together even more powerfully than they would ordinarily in signs that are in sextile to each other. So that just gives that sun in the first house, that Libra energy, just more light and more power. And notice what's happening to Venus in his chart, but it's right on the north node, which is where the tide is coming in. Just a lot of strength. The Venus is crossing the ecliptic as it meets as he is born. And so that ability to bring that attention to himself, Leo, to Libra, and his mission in the world, very, very strong in his chart. Also, you see, when you think of longevity, you think of Saturn, and you see Saturn in his chart is very close to the ascendant, just 5 degrees away, even though it's in the next sign. And so Saturn with ascendant, you think it could be some problems with the body, some struggles maybe with energy. But if Saturn is reinforced, it can give the body, especially in Scorpio, the ability to heal and regenerate. And so notice what Saturn is ruled by, but Mars. And Mars is in Saturn's sign, and Saturn is in Mars's sign. So again, that wonderful mutual reception. This is very unusual to see not one, but two mutual receptions in a chart, especially using just the 7 traditional planets. And so that Mars is bolstered and strengthened by its partnership with Mars and Aquarius. And notice also that Mars is doing something else that strengthens it. It is in trine to his ascendant from the 5th house, which is a very positive, good fortune house, supporting that ascendant. I always sometimes forget when I first look at a chart to notice the angle, the aspects planets make to the ascendant and the midheaven, because that often tells you a lot about the ability of the planet to work for the native. But you think, well, that Mars can't be too super strong because it's on the south node. And you say, yes, it is. However, notice that it is at the south node and it's a malefic. And so you think of the tide going out around that kind of malefic energy in the chart is a more fortunate placement than if it were at the north node. We want the malefics at the south node, and then more energy being brought into the chart with the benefic at the north node. So he's got that Venus-Mars opposition very well placed in his chart. Other things you can notice in the chart that would stand out is he's got a Mercury in dignity. Mercury is in Virgo, where it has not just dignity by sign, but also by exaltation. And so this Mercury in Virgo is particularly able to analyze, dissect, kind of look through a lot of difficult material and kind of get to the hub of it. If you placed in the 12th house for a public servant, this is somebody who is able to connect with the masses. And Jimmy Carter was very famous for being able to speak plainly. You know, he was considered the peanut farmer from Georgia, and to reach people just by speaking very directly and simply to them. Also notice another planet in dignity in his chart is this Jupiter, which is in Sagittarius, in his third house of communication, strengthening his communication skills, but also bringing into his communication a kind of fervor with Jupiter and Sagittarius there, its own sign. He's a very religious man, continues, I think, until he recently became ill to teach Sunday school in his Baptist church. So he has this deep faith and belief that he carries into the way he communicates and into the ideas and concepts that he forms. So we've got then a chart that's pretty spectacular in its placements. You know, if you were looking at this young Jimmy Carter way back in Plains, Georgia, you think this guy is probably destined for something pretty significant in the world. The only planet in his chart that is in its fall or detriment is the moon in Scorpio. And you see that moon in Scorpio is in its fall. And so that tells us that kind of the history of his family, his roots, his nurturing, there were some difficulties there. And also then emotionally, he might have trouble processing things, or things might kind of build up emotionally and he can't really express them. He can kind of get caught between his own passions and his need to express them. And of course, it helps that the moon is in good aspect to that Mercury, so he should be able to work through that as he lives his life. But also, notice that what does that moon rule in his chart? It rules the midheaven. And so while Jimmy Carter has had a very successful life on many levels, he was not considered to be that successful as a president. You know, the main goal of his life, to be president of the United States, he ended up being defeated for a second term, leaving office with a lot of poor opinions of him. And so while everything else in his chart is supporting, you know, his very successful life, there's something about his goal, his ambition, his role in the world that has the aspect of fall about it, that maybe something tried very hard, but he just couldn't quite connect with the job, with the mission, that the man in the moment didn't necessarily come together as it needed to when he was president. Also, you think that moon with Saturn in the second house could suggest some financial problems. And he's very open about the fact that when he left the White House, he was broke. His family business was peanut farming. They had had several bad years. It turns out it's very expensive to live at the White House. I didn't realize that, but the president receives a bill every month for food and lodging. And so he had to kind of fight his way back from bankruptcy, I think, to become financially solvent again after he left the presidency. So that's a look at the basic traditional planets in his chart. But let's take a look then at the outer planets and see how they fill in the rest of the story. And so if we look at his chart, the first thing we see is this wonderful Venus that supports that sun by mutual reception, enhanced by the North Node, is enhanced also by being with Neptune. And so this is someone who's very idealistic. He very much expresses that Libra ideal of seeking peace and justice in the world. His post-presidency has been very dedicated to helping create fair elections, economic equality, end of human suffering. He believes in human rights. He set up the Carter Center to promote his ideals for universal dignity of all human beings. And he's also, because it's all of that energy, that Leo energy is powering that Libra sun in the first house with his ascendant, he was very much a promoter of peace in his presidency. He worked very hard to achieve peace in the Middle East, which we all know that can be that can be a very difficult task indeed. But he has lived by that credo, though, that his values as a Christian is to kind of bring universal kindness and compassion to all human beings, and he's worked very hard to achieve that ideal in his life. And then also, if we notice, his chart has Pluto right up here in his 10th house. So that can explain, his significant ambition. Someone, Pluto in Cancer, wanting to bring that great nurturing energy into the highest office in the land. Very much kind of the role of Pluto is playing there. But what is Pluto doing in his chart? Notice that it's in square to that Libra sun. And so when you've got the first house planet, this is something you want to express, that you want to say, this is coming from me, my ideals, this is what I believe, and this is what I want to do. If the sun is in your first house, you have a really strong sense of mission. But the 10th house sits over the first house. It's considered to be the superior position in the square. And so the 10th house can overcome the first. And so Pluto, you think about forces beyond your control. And this was very much the case in Jimmy Carter's presidency. The years he was president, from 1976 to 1980, there was an oil embargo. The economy tanked. Inflation was rampant. Also, during his presidency, there was a coup in Iran, and a number of Americans at the embassy there were seized by protesters and held hostage for many, many months. And so we saw that he was very much faced with forces beyond his control as president. And probably no one worked harder or with greater heart than Jimmy Carter as president, but just couldn't overcome the forces that were really working against him. He even at one point kind of threw up his hands and said, we're suffering this great malaise. I think that was after we had made this failed attempt to rescue the hostages in Iran. And that just kind of set the tone for all of the United States at that time, that we just all felt that sense of defeat as well. Notice that Pluto sits right on, Jimmy Carter's Pluto sits right on the U.S. sun in the Sibley chart. And interestingly enough, while he was president, Pluto was right here in Libra, squaring that midheaven. So he was not only working out that square in his chart, but Pluto itself was coming along to emphasize that in his chart. It's kind of like an aspect whose time had come during those years of his presidency. But Pluto tears down only to rebuild. As Pluto crossed his ascendant, then he reemerged as a post-president and went on to many, many achievements in that role. And then the one outer planet we haven't taken a look yet is this Uranus, over here in Pisces in the 6th house. And so this is a planet in Pisces that it shows how much Jimmy Carter has really kind of distinguished himself in his post-presidency. He's got that Uranus in trine to that Scorpio moon. And he just after he lost the presidency, kind of turned around and looked at the world and said, where can I serve? That Uranus in the 6th house of service, in Pisces, the sign of universal compassion, and Uranus looking for kind of an unusual path. And so he, for example, worked with Habitat for Humanity. He would organize with people to provide hurricane relief. His last goal was to work on I think it's called the African guinea worm, which infects, millions of people, especially children. And he's worked very hard to eradicate it. So that healthcare issue has been very near and dear to his heart in his post-presidency. Notice that Uranus is opposite to his Mercury. In his presidency particularly, he sometimes had trouble reading the room, which you would think that Mercury in the 12th house, so well aspected, could enable him to connect with the masses, but that Uranus over here could kind of throw him a curveball. But he has this idea that he considers to be, very important that he needs to express, and he kind of gets caught up in that, and things kind of blow up on him. I think one way Jimmy Carter is remembered in a very unfortunate way is that he made the decision that because of tensions we were having with the USSR, that our United States athletes wouldn't compete in the Summer Olympics in Moscow in 1980. And that was a decision that, of course, wrecked the lives of thousands and thousands of our athletes and their hopes and dreams. And it's still today remembered in a very unfortunate way. And so we've got, you can see kind of the blessings in the chart, but you can also see the difficulties and the challenges. It's interesting, too, if we come back to this Mars with the South Node in the 5th house, that, part of his legacy was this kind of disastrous decision to withhold our athletes from participating in the Olympics. So that's kind of shows how that Mars with the South Node can be working. Now, another thing about Jimmy Carter that shows, though, his resilience and his ability to rise above difficulties in his life, in 2014, 15, around there, it was pretty much announced, it was time to say goodbye to Jimmy Carter. He has a family history of cancer. Both of his parents and 3 of his siblings all died from cancer. So you can see that's an interesting manifestation of that moon in Scorpio. But he, when he developed cancer, it was kind of assumed, well, he's around, he was in his late 80s at that time. And he was going through something that people are more and more going to be going through now, which is the Pluto opposition. For many years, Pluto, because it has an elliptical orbit, spends several decades in a sign, and so people would not have their Pluto opposition until they were well past 100 years old. But now, because Pluto is moving along more quickly in the signs of Libra and Scorpio and Sagittarius, it is bringing that Pluto in opposition to our natal Pluto around when we're in our late 80s. So those of us who have Pluto in Leo, for example, will be in the next 20 years having our Pluto opposition. And so you think, well, he's been hit with cancer, it's square his sun, Pluto's in opposition. But no, he got treatment, and within a few years, he was found to be cancer-free. And so I think it's kind of a tribute to how that Scorpio moon can regenerate there in his chart. He felt very strongly that he still had work to do, particularly with the healthcare challenges that he was facing, trying to overcome the diseases that were very close to his heart, trying to cure them. And so he ended up having surgery and going on to live, well, let's see, since then, about 8 more years. And so that's kind of interesting how those of us facing Pluto returns in the upcoming decade or two will have to think, oh, it is a chance to maybe face some difficulties, but also a chance to regenerate. And so if you think about Jimmy Carter's chart now, of course, we know Pluto's been in Capricorn. And so it's now going back and forth over his IC. I don't think you can look at a chart and see this is a moment when someone's going to die. I know there are techniques and ancient astrologers taught the techniques, but I tend to believe that the moment we pass from this earth is as mysterious as the moment that we're born. And I think it kind of all is dependent upon our soul and the decisions our soul makes. That's just kind of how I feel about it. I think you can look at a chart and see that there are some very grave aspects that this person is facing, and that being 98 years old could possibly lead to his life ending. But Pluto's going to go back and forth over this IC a couple of more times. Saturn has certainly been hitting his Mars, that Mars with the South Node. When he made the decision to leave the hospital and come home to hospice care, Saturn was crossing that Saturn. So you can certainly see that, his body is definitely wearing out and facing some challenges. But also you think, well, this is kind of a human being who's lived life with a great deal of vitality and love for family and his work and his mission. And so who knows, he might just kind of settle into hospice care for a number of months in the future and still continue to be impacting people and living out what he hopes to be his life's mission as these next months go by. So we'll just have to see. One thing, though, I can suggest is Uranus in his 8th house, of the house of death, of course, will eventually reach, let's see, the early 20s as we get into the summer. And so that can tell us that that is a time of liberation. And it's making a square to his nodal axis, and then that Venus-Mars opposition. So I would imagine that would be a time that there's a turning, whether he passes and leaves his body, or if he has another regeneration and will be with us a while longer. So we'll just have to wait and see about that. But in any case, I just looking at this chart, I feel very thankful to Jimmy Carter and to Rosalind for their service for all these years. They've done much good in the world and have been shining examples to many of us of how to live a worthy and a life that's based on service and humility. So thank you so much for joining me, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.